Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive question. What exactly is the current U.S. administration trying to achieve with its foreign policy, and how are they going about it? To figure that out, we're zeroing in on one of the most complex, high-stakes diplomatic relationships on the planet right now, the United States and Mexico in 2026. We're going to break down how the Trump administration is navigating this dynamic, specifically looking at three massive pressure points: trade, migration, and drug trafficking. Let's get right into it. So think about it. How in the world do you manage a relationship of this scale when the diplomatic tools at play involve intense economic threats and, well, really serious national security concerns? It's not easy. Under the Trump and Sheinbaum administrations, these three pillars we mentioned, trade, migration, and drug trafficking, are just completely tangled up together. You literally can't touch one without sending shockwaves through the others. And as we'll see, the policies coming out of Washington have these profound, sometimes totally unintended consequences on the ground in Mexico, which then bounce right back onto U.S. security. To really understand where we are, we need a quick look at how we got here. The economic foundation was laid decades ago with NAFTA back in 1994, which completely wired North American supply chains together before being updated to the USMCA in 2020. But recently, the political landscape shifted fast. In late 2024, Claudia Sheinbaum was inaugurated as Mexico's president. Then just months later, in January 2025, the second Trump term kicked off in the U.S., bringing this very assertive America-first approach to foreign policy. And now, both nations are basically barreling toward July 2026 for a massive, high-stakes joint review of the USMCA. And when we say high stakes, we are talking about $840 billion. That is the total bilateral goods trade between the U.S. and Mexico in 2025. Just wrap your head around that number for a second. Mexico isn't just a neighbor, they are the absolute top U.S. trading partner in goods. We're talking more than Canada, more than China. We share huge imports and exports, electronics, machinery, auto parts, that all rely on this deeply shared production chain. So any disruption here doesn't just ruffle diplomatic feathers, it sends immediate, very real shockwaves through both economies. Yet, this massive economic engine is basically being used as the main bargaining chip right now. Because of that, you end up with two deeply contrasting strategies at play. On one side, the U.S. policy approach is highly transactional. It relies heavily on economic coercion, like threatening or actually slapping on massive 25% tariffs to force Mexico to act on U.S. priorities, mainly stopping fentanyl and unauthorized migration. On the other side, President Sheinbaum is walking an incredibly delicate tightrope. Her diplomatic stance involves trying to accommodate Washington, deploying thousands of troops to the border and transferring drug traffickers to U.S. custody. But she draws a hard line at direct U.S. military intervention. She's trying to protect Mexican sovereignty while desperately avoiding a devastating trade war. Moving on to our second pillar, the migration pillar, and specifically a shifting humanitarian burden. Right now, the primary goal for the U.S. administration is absolute deterrence. They want to keep migrants outside U.S. territory, and they're leveraging that massive economic power over Mexico to make it happen. Looking at the ground level, the U.S. has rolled out some intensely enforcement-centric policies. They restarted the Remain in Mexico program and essentially suspended asylum entries at the southwest border. And Mexico? Well, to appease those U.S. tariff threats, they deployed 10,000 extra National Guard troops to their own borders. Meanwhile, the U.S. has been running deportation flights, sending non-Mexican nationals deep into southern Mexico. Now, yes, these policies have absolutely slashed border encounters, but they've also fundamentally shifted the logistical burden directly onto Mexican soil, stretching their shelters and institutional resources to the absolute breaking point. And this leads us to a pretty severe unintended consequence of the current policy. Research from Kenninghaus estimates that human smuggling networks are now generating somewhere between $4 and $12 billion a year. That is a staggering amount of money. By enforcing policies that effectively trap thousands of highly vulnerable migrants in northern Mexican border cities that are already dealing with high levels of armed violence, these measures have inadvertently created this massive resource pool for organized crime. Cartels are increasingly shifting their focus toward human smuggling because restrictive immigration policies have literally turned it into a booming, incredibly lucrative business. Which brings us right to the most volatile issue of all, drug trafficking, and specifically fentanyl. The U.S. administration has actually declared a national emergency over this and adopted a very punitive, heavily militarized approach to counter drug policy. But researchers and analysts are raising a big question here. Will these aggressive, supply focused strategies actually dismantle the cartels, or are they just going to trigger a new, even more complex security crisis? To really understand the U.S. strategy, we have to look at a massive policy shift that happened in 2025. The Trump administration officially designated 6 Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs. The legal weight behind this is huge. It triggers a U.S. legal framework that basically criminalizes any material support to these groups. This is a dramatic escalation. It aligns with the U.S. national defense strategy that prioritizes homeland defense above all else, and it even keeps unilateral U.S. military strikes inside Mexico on the table, which, as you can imagine, puts a massive strain on diplomatic trust with the Sheinbaum administration. But there are some serious structural flaws here, according to research from groups like the Washington Office on Latin America and Canning House. Because that FTO designation is so broad, think about an extorted asylum seeker. If they are forced to pay a cartel-linked smuggler just to survive, they could technically face prosecution for providing material support to terrorists. Even U.S. businesses operating in Mexico are terrified they might run afoul of these same laws if they get extorted. Add in the lingering threat of unilateral U.S. military action, and you severely damage the kind of cross-border intelligence sharing both countries actually need. Plus, historically speaking, these heavily militarized, supply-focused kingpin strategies often just cause cartels to fracture into smaller, much more violent factions. And that makes the fentanyl trade even harder to track down. So as we reflect on the future of this bilateral relationship, this 2025 warning from Canning House really stands out. They argue that an insular America-first approach might actually backfire. Their research points out that if the U.S. isolates itself, focuses purely on punitive supply-side militarization, and alienates its most important regional partner through constant economic threats, it risks strengthening the exact criminal economies it's trying to destroy. A lot of analysts argue that effective security policy requires addressing root causes, things like institutional weakness, corruption, and of course, the massive demand for synthetic opioids inside the U.S. Ultimately, the United States and Mexico are locked in an $840 billion embrace. There's simply no untangling that. The current U.S. foreign policy has successfully used the threat of economic devastation to force immediate short-term compliance on migration and drugs. But as we look ahead to the 2026 USMCA review and beyond, we really have to ask ourselves, what happens to long-term hemispheric security when the world's most vital border becomes a permanent bargaining chip? Can a relationship defined by ultimatums survive the immense pressures of modern geopolitics? That is the question both nations will have to answer in the years to come. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.